Charlie Kirk, the conservative activist and founder of Turning Point USA, was heinously gunned down while answering questions at an event in Utah on a college campus. You are joining us now for the interview where we discuss esoteric elements of anything that's making headlines and try to get to what's really going on in the national news. Now, investigators have arrested the shooter. The 22-year-old assailant was arrested and is being held without bail, facing aggravated murder charges and firearm-related offenses. It's being called a political assassination. Utah's Governor Spencer Cox said the shooter had been radicalized fairly quickly. And the question is how? How? And in what way? Hal Kempfer, a former Marine intelligence officer, joins me now. And Hal, you were talking about how you worked in counterintelligence for a very long time and taught that specifically to students. The first thing we want to say, obviously, this is a heinous killing. Our thoughts and prayers are certainly with Charlie Kirk's family. And words should never be met with bullets. If we get to that point, what happens to our republic?
Well, Hilary, if violent extremism is the only way we express things, then essentially we will be in a state of social upheaval across the country. This is the concept of law and order, a nation of laws, that has been talked about. And really what the U.S. is across the world, we've always been kind of a symbol of that, which has been a nation of laws. Of course, we have had times where there was, great domestic strife in the United States. And of course, the Civil War, where the country actually divided, and with extraordinary violence within the states. But really, Charlie Kirk had some, let's just say he had some strong views. All right, and he definitely was, leaning towards one part of the spectrum, shall we say, in terms of his political philosophy. And but one thing that he did represent was at least civil discourse. Regardless of what he said, he always seemed to maintain his demeanor, and he would promote discussion. And it has stood out to many that it's very strange that somebody who kind of dedicated himself to that sort of dialogue or discussion or ways of challenging ideas or confronting ideas was gunned down by someone who took it to a very violent extremist end.
Hal, since the last time we spoke, we know a little bit more about the investigation, and I had a chance to look at the affidavit that was filed by FBI officials about how they tracked the suspect, where they found him, the limp that he had, which seems to suggest, based on that, I think a lot of analysts are saying he had that gun tucked inside of his pants. Let's start there. Do you think that happened, that when he had his ingress into campus, he had the weapon stored basically in his leg?
Well, based on the video that I saw when it showed him walking across the parking lot when he was going in, and he was kind of feigning a limp, it was pretty clear that he had the weapon tucked into his pants, down his pant leg, and that is with a long rifle, unless you have some way to basically take it apart, which he could have potentially, although with that particular Mauser 98 30-06, I think he still would have had a problem even if he took it apart. And then, of course, that's not a weapon that you easily take apart and put back together either. So yeah, he was disguising it by basically walking on to campus with a limp. Interestingly, human behavior, when someone's, many cases with disabilities or something, or somebody sees someone walking with a limp, people actually will tend not to. They will actually avert their eyes and not pay much attention to them. And so that may have worked in a very subconscious way with helping him with his ingress onto campus. That a lot of people would see someone walking with an injury or disability or something like that, and they may not pay as much attention to him as they would somebody who is walking normally.
We talked about the access to the rooftop, and I was actually scouring the internet prior to this to find out if this was a campus building that the suspect got on top of, or if it was a building that was adjacent. When I asked you when we spoke on Thursday about how in the world he could have had access, I was drawing from my own experience on my own college campus and then on others, and that typically, because college students are young, their brains are still developing, access to rooftops is strictly limited. If they, I mean, we don't want college kids going up on rooftops and doing crazy things. So do we know a little bit more now about how that suspect may have gotten up there and why the rooftop was open?
Well, it wasn't that it was open per se. What he did was he went up some stairwell, and there's video of him going up that stairwell. And then there was a wall that separated people from the rooftop. Well, it was a very short wall, so he just climbed over the wall. And then, based on what's been reported, he kind of ducked down. Now, I don't know what the shadow effect was with the wall, but he had changed into dark clothing when he got to campus. So he may have ducked down the wall, kind of tucked into the shadows, so he wouldn't stand out. He wouldn't profile himself. If you were looking on that rooftop, you wouldn't have seen anything. It would just look like basically just the wall, being you would see. And then at whenever he considered the right time, he did kind of a crouch run, if you will. He was basically staying a low profile, getting to the edge of the rooftop where he got into the prone position. And that was where he, basically took that fatal shot. I should mention that he had I mentioned the weapon. It's not a new weapon. It's been around for a long time. But he had a scope on it. And, you can be a pretty mediocre shot with sighted-in optics, or we call them zeroed-in optics. And you can be a pretty mediocre shot, but actually be a pretty good shot with a scope. And I don't, a lot of discussion early on, people were saying, was he a military trained sniper or something like that? I don't see any indication that now we know he definitely was not. He had no training, but there is some indication that he did some shooting when he was younger. Rural Utah, particularly southern Utah, and I've spent some time up there. A lot of a lot of outdoor activities, hunting. And there's indications that he handled weapons when he was younger, growing up. So he could be a kind of a mediocre shot, a so-so shooter, probably out doing hunting or just shooting at things out in out in the countryside. But with that scope at 150 yards to 200 yards, he would be accurate, and that kind of explains how that happens. And then once he took the shot, it was a single shot, and with the scope, he would have been able to see the effect that he had. So he would have seen Charlie Kirk once he was hit, basically going back. And then, of course, probably would have seen the blood. And as we know, it was probably intended to be a headshot. A lot of speculation as to why they shoot the neck. Some people had some ideas. I don't think there was any intent to shoot the headshot or shoot his neck. I think it was probably aiming at a headshot, and he may have had the weapon zeroed in at 100 yards, and he's taken the shot from 150 to 200 yards, which would have been a slight declination in terms of the round hitting just below where he intended, and that would explain why it hit his neck instead of his head. I know this is gruesome. I'm sorry if anybody out there, I'm just explaining what's going on. And then at that point, he got up into another crouch run, maintaining a low profile, going across the roof. And once he got across the roof, then he climbed down off the roof and jumped down to the ground. And that was where he, basically left the campus, making his way into a residential neighborhood, a small wooded area. And I have to tell you, that's in southern Utah, that's a pretty dry environment up there. So there aren't a lot of wooded areas per se. And that is where he basically dropped the weapon, and then made his egress and went back to southern Utah.
Yeah, it's a perfect
I'm sorry, he was in Orem. I should say anywhere in Utah in that area. I'm sorry, he was in Orem. There's not a lot of really good wooded areas, and that was something that was brought up. They said there's not a lot of wooded areas, but he made his way back to back to St. George, down to southern Utah area.
Yeah, and that's a good clarification on the access to the rooftop. And maybe that's a better way to say it, not necessarily open, but how could someone, knowing the rise in political violence that we're seeing, why wouldn't the university necessarily make rooftops in that area inaccessible, fully inaccessible? I want to transition to the FBI investigation and some of the criticism that's now been waged against Kash Patel. But before that, let's talk about the hunt for the suspect. You noted that, and we discussed it on Thursday, the FBI was able to very carefully track, because of the surveillance video in that area, where the suspect was, his ingress and egress, and yet after 30 plus hours, it was family members who turned him into the FBI, turned him into investigators. So it's not as though they tracked him. Now looking back with hindsight, why weren't they able to do this on their own, given the fact that there was such strong video evidence basically showing his every move on campus?
They could track him on campus. They had pretty good CCTV coverage, if you will. They could see him coming in. They could see him going out. They got a pretty good shot of him, although he tried to disguise himself with a hat and sunglasses. And that works to a certain extent. But my sense is that once he got out of there, first off, you got 3,000 people in the crowd. And one of the things that I noticed was when the shots went out, everybody took off. Now, that's a big discussion for campus security. And you may recall that I teach a thing called crowd manager. And I do this in a variety of areas. I do it in Las Vegas. This is teaching, basically those running large events, how to manage a crowd when certain things happen. An active shooter or a shooting scenario is one of the things that we talk about specifically. But one of the things we always emphasize is that when you give them direction, you give them near-term direction to get them out of harm's way, but you give them longer-term direction as to where to go. Because at some point, you want to be able to talk to people. You want to be able to interview witnesses. You want to find out if there were other victims that, in some cases that may be somewhere that first responders don't know about. There's a lot of reasons, but you don't just tell people to take off. And that has happened many times. They'll take off, and that's how the shooter can kind of disappear. I think that was one of the problems with this, was that when everybody just kind of took off in their own direction, it made it difficult from an investigative standpoint to use some of those techniques, which could involve looking at cell phones being pinged or wherever location stuff. It would have made it very difficult to figure out or isolate him from the shooter from everything else going on. And I think that was where they made the decision to go public with the video and the pictures in hopes of somebody recognizing him, which in this case, that actually worked. That's exactly how they got him.
All right, so let's talk about Kash Patel and the FBI. Do you think the claims that the FBI dropped the ball or didn't move fast enough here are warranted? And does it have any relationship to senior career officials in Utah with the FBI who had recently been let go? And did that have any effect on the structural ability to respond to this with people who were familiar with the area and had deep expertise?
That's something that you have to take a look at, is when you move people out that have been there for a while, that really know the terrain, that know the area. For whatever reason you move them out, you're basically accepting a certain amount of risk, and that you're going to have someone come in to replace them. There is this thought, and certainly from the military culture, we've always had this kind of ingrained that people are replaceable, and we do. We move people in and out of positions all the time. But we also recognize that we pay a price for that in terms of continuity, expertise, things like that. And FBI is no different. And so moving out, that will be something they're going to have to assess, is did they lose some not knowledge of the state, but also key relationships. It takes a long time to build trust and confidence with other law enforcement agencies, other organizations across the board. And when you take out key personnel, some of that fluidity of information sharing and interoperability will be lost as well. Now, one of the things that was a mistake early on, and I don't know that they're going to say it wasn't. I mean, I don't imagine Kash Patel's going to admit it was a mistake, but one of the things where they said, look, we had a suspect in custody, or the shooter in custody, was kind of alluding to the shooter being in custody. And the shooter was not in custody. It was a person of interest they were interviewing. There were two persons of interest they interviewed. One was kind of sort of a political gadfly that shows up at these things and was sort of claiming that he was responsible or something, but he was kind of kind of out there and everybody knew who he was, but they took him into, they detained him and interviewed him. And then there was somebody else that was another person of interest that turned out not to be the shooter. But they got to be very careful, and any investigator would be very careful and know not to use the term custody in terms of something like that, because it implies that they found the shooter. And of course, for many out there, they would assume, oh, they got the shooter, so why am I looking so hard? That was the wrong terminology to use. And I think that may have cost them some time. Interestingly, later when Kash Patel showed up at a press conference prior to the apprehension of the suspect, or the apprehension of the alleged shooter, it was interesting to watch that press conference because Kash Patel said absolutely nothing. The director of the FBI flew all the way across the country, went to a press conference with the governor, and said absolutely nothing. And I found there might have been some discussion internally, which is, you need to be there, be seen, but don't say anything until we have something. And of course, the next day, or very shortly afterwards, they did have something.
Yeah. What kind of terminology do you think is appropriate? Because, I mean, even here in our business, we'll use person of interest, apprehended. So we will identify them as a person of interest. So the custody portion is the particular verbiage that you take issue with, but you think it would have been fine for them to announce we've apprehended or we're questioning a person of interest. Is that what I should understand?
Yeah, absolutely. If they said, look, we're interviewing a person of interest or persons of interest, I think that would have been fine.
Okay.
You know, if you say we've detained individuals who are being interviewed who are persons of interest, that would have been fine. But when you start saying we have taken them into custody, that kind of implies that maybe they have been, quote, booked, all right, that something more has taken place there, that we have somebody, a suspect, somebody who we believe. And that was kind of what was alluded to in what was said initially. And of course, that's where he's getting a lot of criticism, is that the terminology was just terminology that investigators, law enforcement would not use that terminology because they know it's kind of loaded with a lot of inference in terms of what that means. He did use it. And honestly, he may have thought, based on what they were telling him, that they actually had the suspect in custody. He may have misinterpreted what was said there. And it's just could have been just an honest mistake. But obviously, I could tell immediately when he showed up at that second press conference, he realized that he had misspoken or basically, talked beyond what they actually had. And of course, it's very embarrassing when you say we have a suspect in custody and then you let them go, and then everybody's kind of scratching their head thinking what exactly happened there. And the reality was they did not have a suspect in custody. They had a person of interest detained that was being interviewed. And so you have to be kind of exact on this. And this deals with, strategic communications and how they do this. And I think there were some lessons learned that will be taken from this across the board.
Yeah. And technically, the connotation of custody as opposed to the actual definition of custody, they wouldn't be wrong to use it, but I understand the inferences that you're concerned people might take from that. So I just want to make that clarification as well, because from a very, just the denotation of it, he's actually correct that the person of interest was in custody, was in the care or guardianship of the police at the time, or the investigators who were talking to those people. But I see your point. Okay, Let's move on to what this may lead to. You discussed, we had a former assistant chief here locally with the Detroit Police Department who also said bulletproof glass maybe around speakers who do something outside. Maybe just no longer you're doing these outside venues with a political speaker. I know there are a couple who work in the space on YouTube, Ben Shapiro, for example, who said he's not doing them anymore. He's going to be inside where there can't be a vantage point from up top. So clearly some of those changes are already happening. And then the question of the chilling effect for citizens, even not just those who have ideas that may be controversial, but they don't want to go to places where folks who are speaking may be saying things that are controversial because there could be someone in the crowd who takes violence that could affect others. So what do you see as the change in security? Is it reasonable to have bulletproof glass around folks? Should we be using drones more to make sure that top vantage points are not accessible to potential snipers? What changes now?
I think both of those things are going to be what we're going to see. First off, you look at what happened in Western Pennsylvania with Butler, Pennsylvania, with the shoot, where basically President Trump was shot. Not fortunately not seriously shot, but he was wounded in his ear. And you look at that again, a sniper on a rooftop. The parallels of that to this. Of course, there's other parallels too, which is a whole online culture thing, and that's a separate issue. But there were some real parallels to that. And then you go back to Las Vegas with the Route 91 concert shooting, where the sniper set up in Mandalay Bay Hotel and shot down into the venue with a number of modified assault rifles, shooting almost full automatic fire. That has changed the way people view these things. And in those things, now Route 91, you weren't going to build a plex or a ballistic glass around the venue, but with these shooters, particularly if they're controversial, where they get a lot of online hate or threats, that those are people that maybe need to upgun. That's a really wrong phrase. To increase the amount of security that they have around them. Ballistic glass is one thing. One thing I would point out, though, is drones. Drones for defensive purposes, if they had drone coverage around that event, if there had been a drone going, it might have been a little irritating to have a drone flying around, but that is a low-cost, low-impact way of maintaining visibility on all the rooftops, all the windows, and it's something, if you're a sniper, it puts a great deal of uncertainty into the venue because they know they have drones out there, so the chances of discovery are that much higher. I think they're going to have to look at using drones in these, surveillance reconnaissance modes, and also there are drones that have been modified with a variety of different there's obviously lethal drones, but less than lethal things where they can use light, sound, even things like irritants like pepper spray in such a way that they could have, all those things would have been very effective in probably dissuading or disrupting this potential shooter from doing what they're doing. So that's a big part of it. The other thing I think we're going to see is magnetometers. That's kind of old school. I mean, that's great, but you got to push the perimeter way out. That's why the inside venue thing works, because you can control the ingress and egress of everybody coming in and control the space better. But also probably more use of more passive systems like facial recognition technology, stuff like that, where they can see a lot of people and then quickly collate that with various databases to see if anybody poses a threat. These are all things that we'll probably see more of in the future in terms of providing security for these venues. But I think that's a good point, which I think you're going to find some are going to say, look, I'm not doing outdoor events anymore. I'm just going to do indoor events because, frankly, we can secure those better.
Yeah. That just may be the way of the future, at least for a period of time. Let's talk about radicalization. And there's so much that I'm not even really touching on today because some of this information may change. And we've got an arraignment that's coming up on Tuesday. Once that happens, there's going to be a lot of information beyond the affidavit and the charging documents that will reveal the truth of a lot of this, backed up by some evidentiary stuff, instead of us sort of speculating on how radicalized this person was. Let's talk about, though, generally radicalization. In the wake of this, Spencer Cox talked about social media as being a cancer, and even later said that maybe it's metastasized beyond that because it can give a lot of exposure and access to vulnerable people, to radical ideas and radical behavior. But there is a difference between a sort of cognitive radicalization where you're exposed to intense memes or intense ideas that sometimes can actually bring people back to the center, and behavioral radicalization. How do you distinguish between the two? Because we need to have an open exchange of ideas, some of which will inherently be radical, without ever that leading to a behavioral conclusion where someone then thinks it's ever acceptable to use violence, because it never is.
Well, one of the things that we need to do probably a better job with, look, we have computer forensics, online investigative techniques are out there. We probably need to put a lot more resources into that, because that's where you're going to find a lot of these violent extremists. That's where they're communicating. That's where they're getting radicalized. We've been watching this over the last 20 years. You know, after 9/11, we were really looking for something like the 9/11 conspiracy. You know, you have foreign terrorists come into the U.S. or kind of like sleeper cells, if you will, hence that term, and they're over here plotting and coming up with their thing. And that was kind of what we were looking at. But what we started to see afterwards was a lot of these lone wolves, and they weren't necessarily tied to any ideological belief in what Al-Qaeda was about or later ISIS was about or anything like that. A lot of them had very domestic agendas, although some of those domestic agendas have a transnational nature in them. And they were radicalizing themselves mostly online. And what we found, as was alluded to when the governor was on, Governor of Utah was on today, was talking about the Reddit subculture, which is kind of an interesting thing because a lot of us see Reddit all the time online. You know, you see Reddit if you're looking for reviews on anything from kitchen counters, whatever. But there are these subreddit areas where you can get into, where you can get into some very extreme social, political, ideological discussions. There's an anonymity feature that you can use with that. Same thing as it's been reported that he was tied to Discord. Discord was originally a gaming platform, but the advantage of that was you could get in there and have these one-on-one conversations. It actually provided a lot of tools very similar to what you see with other social media, to include YouTube and Zoom and things like that, in terms of having these discussions. And then there's ways to bring in third-party software for anonymity. But what this does is it provides platforms where individuals who are, 20 or 30 years ago were geographically disparate. They couldn't share these ideas. They couldn't find anybody who was like-minded because of distance and everything else. Well, they can go online and boom, they're instantly connected to a bunch of people who think like they do or more radicalized like they do, who share their thoughts, and then they kind of amp each other up. And then you go into, basically the pathway or road to radicalization. There's a process there, and and to really simplify it is, at first they start thinking, okay, they look out there, there's something they feel it's not right, okay, and then they take another step and they go, it's not only not right, it's just systemically not fair, and that's where they start to get that ideological thing. In this case, we'll find out what his ideology was. It's been alluded to that it may have been what was being referred to as left-wing extremism, but there could be some other issues that tie to it as well. But then they go from it's not fair to saying it's your fault, and at that point, they're basically putting blame specifically. Now, he's 22 years old. That is that age group that Charlie Kirk was talking to. In his mind, when he looks at someone who expresses those ideas, probably the person who expresses them most to him and to those he knows or his friends would be Charlie Kirk. So he basically obsessed on Charlie Kirk, clearly, and he saw him as the person that he was going to blame. It's his fault. He's saying these things, it's his fault. And then he goes down a pathway of saying it's your fault, and then mentally he starts justifying why he's allowed to use violence or extreme violence in order to address that. And there are certain key words, phrases, things that you look and listen for that tell someone is moving down that slippery slope where they basically will do something like what we just saw up in Orem, Utah.
Right. And I think we're probably going to have to leave it there, but you also could look at this from through the lens of Ari Kruglansky's theories of a quest for significance, where sometimes we're trying to think about this in a way that someone is completely motivated by a very coherent ideology, and that is really just misplaced, and that there is also this existential hunger, and that anyone who commits this kind of heinous act, there's also something else going on. It's not just one thing. Yes, something may have helped radicalize them, but in all, left, right, whatever we're looking at, there's also that framework that it's complicated and multi-layered. Thank you so much, Hal Kempfer. We appreciate you for joining us and giving us a lot of insight.
All right. Thank you, Hilary.